In the final week of our course, we examine a second contemporary social and ethical issue, namely race. The title of the essay, Racisms, reflects the fact that racism takes many different forms. Appiah's most general aim is to better understand racism in order to offer the strongest rejection of it. In the main part of the essay, Appiah presents three doctrines that he thinks underpin all particular cases of racism. In the final part of the essay, Appiah examines ways in which people have attempted to justify these doctrines. To convey the difficulty of understanding contemporary racism, Appiah has us imagine trying to explain racism to an alien from another planet. From an outsider's perspective, there are some apparent inconsistencies in our understanding of racism. Let's define racism as mistreating people on the basis of arbitrarily grouping people into different racial groups. The treatment of African Americans as property in the pre-Civil War American South represents a graphic example of this moral evil. Now consider contemporary practices like affirmative action, which are generally seen as morally appropriate. If it is arbitrary to treat people differently based on race, then it might appear as though affirmative action is morally wrong as well. The cartoon offers one response to this line of reasoning regarding the specific context of college admissions. The cartoon suggests that criticism of affirmative action is often hypocritical because often the criticism overlooks other factors that colleges consider when admitting students. Appiah's response is that affirmative action makes sense when you factor in the need to address historical injustices. Georgetown University has made this line of reasoning clearest when it said it would give priority to any students who were descended from slaves who helped build the university. Georgetown argued that since they give priority admission to children of alumni, they are obliged to consider both positive and negative aspects of the university's history. A tougher question is how to differentiate between clubs that seem morally permissible, like Jewish Hillel clubs, in comparison to groups like the KKK. Both organizations differentially treat groups of people based on racial membership. This is one of the questions that most concerns Appiah in the essay. As mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, Appiah's general aim is to reconstruct cases of racism into their most rational form. In doing so, he hopes to object to the strongest form of racism possible. When examining a particular case of racism, three racist propositions can be found together or separate. The three racist propositions or doctrines are: first, racialism; second, extrinsic racism; third, intrinsic racism. Before looking at the details of each position, notice that Appiah thinks all three doctrines are false. The first two are empirically false, while the third is based on a moral error. Racialism is the belief that races possess essential characteristics. That is, there are some features of human nature, whether based in genetics or observable anatomical features, that one race of people all share that no other racial group possesses. Notice that these features do not have to be important. It could be something as trivial as the hair color or the shape of an ear. Extrinsic racism builds on racialism. This doctrine holds that not only are there racial essences, but additionally that these racial essences correspond to morally significant features. This position corresponds roughly to so-called old-fashioned racism. People have argued that some races of people are less trustworthy or more aggressive, and so on. Science has debunked these sorts of claims. They are best understood in the context of the racist cultures of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries than in the context of modern science. It's important to note, if these debunked theories of race had been true, then they would have moral implications. That is to say, if there were a racial group who were more noticeably aggressive than others, then, depending on the severity of the behavior, the group might deserve some differential treatment to handle the greater aggressiveness. Intrinsic racism consists of treating a person differentially based on their racial membership alone. On this doctrine, there is no claim that some races are more or less trustworthy or virtuous or any other morally relevant quality. Instead, a person treats members of one's race differently simply and solely because they are a member of that race. Appiah points to Zionism and Pan-Africanism as two examples of intrinsic racism. Notice that in these cases, the that racism is not necessarily directed against any other group of people. Instead, racial membership can be seen as a way of bonding with other people. One analog to intrinsic racism would be the kind of nationalism you witness at sporting events. The picture on the right is from an Irish soccer game. You can think of intrinsic racism as feeling a special bond to perfect strangers merely on the basis of them being, in this case, Irish. You don't need to believe the people have any especially good qualities about them in order to give them preferential treatment. Racist dispositions refer to the general psychological danger of endorsing racist propositions. These dispositions explain why reasoned argument alone is not enough to eliminate racism. To a large extent, racist dispositions can be understood in terms of human partiality. It is easy to hold an irrational belief when that belief serves one's own self-interest. This is what Appiah means when he says that extrinsic racism often overlaps with human partiality. Racial prejudice refers to the most extreme and irrational form of racist dispositions. The irrationality can even undermine a person's autonomy. For a Kantian like Appiah, lacking autonomy undermines the very basis for rational discussion. Hence, Appiah thinks that for such prejudiced people, they need psychological treatment rather than rational argument. The basic issue that Appiah has with intrinsic racism is that it deforms an individual's moral reasoning. Take the example of Pan-Africanism. Africa covers a very wide range of people with major biological, cultural, and linguistic differences. Appiah argues that the thing Africans have most in common is that they are perceived by others to have the same race. Even if intrinsic racism doesn't harm others, Appiah thinks that at best it betrays a moral confusion about how we should treat people. As a Kantian, from a moral point of view, we should not give some people special treatment due to a morally irrelevant sense of racial membership. Notice that this is different from the case of affirmative action, since affirmative action is based on a history of racial injustice. Accordingly, affirmative action is carried out on an institutional level, such as by colleges judging applicants, rather than by individuals in their private lives. In the personal realm of an individual, Appiah thinks our morally appropriate viewpoint is an impartial standard. Appiah considers two general ways that someone might defend intrinsic racism. The first is claiming that racial preference is analogous to food preference. You don't have to justify why you like pizza or why pistachio ice cream is your favorite ice cream flavor. The difference, Appiah notes, is that intrinsic racism is a moral doctrine, since it informs how we treat other people. The possibility of a violent intrinsic racist is alarming. This would be someone who seeks to harm others based on their racial identity, despite not believing there was any morally significant characteristic that would merit the treatment. Such a person is an example of someone who could not be reasoned with. Hence, Appiah suggests that the appropriate response will be psychological treatment and or imprisonment. Perhaps the most important argument that Appiah makes in the essay concerns whether race could be thought of in terms of a family. Appiah acknowledges that family members hold a special ethical status in an individual's life. He is at pains, however, to stress that this special status does not stem from mere biological relatedness. Biological relatedness is not the same as parents who are causally responsible for bringing a child into the world. Notice, causal responsibility does not necessarily imply biological relatedness. For instance, if a couple relies on a sperm and egg donation in order to conceive a child, there would not be biological relatedness, but the parents would still be responsible for having brought the child into the world. The second and more important source of the family's special ethical status is their shared domestic life. Living with other people brings with it a special ethical relationship. This is why the special ethical status holds between siblings and with extended relatives who live in the same house. If these are the two reasons that families have a special moral status, then race is not comparable. This is because the scale of racial membership makes it highly unlikely that racial relationships could serve similar functions. To put it crudely, you cannot fit the 1 million people in the picture on the right into the same home. Thus, Appiah concludes that it is wrong to argue that races are ethically analogous to big families. To recap Appiah's argument, He thinks that any particular case of racism can be understood in terms of one or multiple of the three doctrines that we have discussed. Racialism and extrinsic racism are both empirically false, since they are based on mistaken views of human nature. Intrinsic racism is morally wrong, since it lacks an impartial moral point of view. One general way to think of Appiah's argument is that color blindness is the morally appropriate point of view, and true color blindness would mark the end of racial injustices. Finally, racist dispositions explain how these doctrines can be held and defended in the face of scientific evidence and moral theories that run to the contrary.